Welcome. Today, joining me is a very special guest, a dear friend, founder of Bluebird, Michiel Kunst. Welcome, buddy.
Thank you for having me, my friend.
And why this is very special is we've known each other for a long time. We've done a ton of collaboration, but most importantly, you are our first sponsor for Founder-Led Sales
Let's
partnership.
go.
Let's go. Thank you. Thank you. And we're going to dive into why Bluebird, about Bluebird, your background, and educate me and other founders on working with recruiters. But let me flatter. Let me intro first. So we've worked together on maybe 20 placements, startups. So typically I'm working with a founder. They bring me in before we make the first sales hire. We need to make the first sales hire. It's gnarly, high failure rate. I can be a pain in the ass. My standards are high. And there's only one recruitment firm that we go to. That's you. We bring you in. You tolerate me. You deal with me, you navigate, right, to find the right person. And we've done it 20 times. And when it came to finding and partnering and working with a recruitment firm for our European founders, there was none other than Bluebird. It was a no-brainer. And it sounds like hopefully it was a no-brainer for you too to join us in
It was.
sponsorship. But thank you, man. Thank you for joining today. And tell me a little bit about Bluebird, how you got here, why you chose to partner with us. Let's hear from you, man.
Cool. Thank you for the warm introduction.
You deserve it.
So, let me tell you a little bit about my background. Like, obviously, but maybe some of the listeners don't. And then I'll tell you a bit about Bluebird. And I think then it will make a lot of sense why I decided to also sponsor Found-led Sales. But I started my career within the software space. So, I'm originally not a recruiter. I have 10 years of experience within sales and sales leadership within software companies. First company I worked for was called Enable Technologies. They were later acquired by SolarWinds. Company with 80 people doing 6 million in revenue. I was one of their first sales reps in Europe, basically built out the European territory from scratch. And that company grew from 6 million in revenue to 250 million in ARR. We were acquired by SolarWinds. We successfully IPO'd. So it was an incredible journey. And I started as an SDR and then became an account executive, then became a sales director, managing a sizable team in continental Europe. And then after the IPO, I stayed for a few years and then decided to leave because I really wanted to be closer to the action again and decided to join a smaller size scale up called FastSpring. And worked really closely with the founder and the chief revenue officer, again, responsible for building out the European territory. Enable was Canadian, FastSpring was an American software company. And after 10 years within sales and sales leadership, I decided to set up a recruitment firm, which is a bit of a weird step, but I've worked with many recruitment agencies in the past. And I felt like if you really want to be a good recruitment consultant, it would help if you have a background in the roles that you recruit for. Let's say, for example, that you want to hire an accountant. Like, accountancy is maybe for some it isn't, but for most it is quite difficult to understand how everything works. So if an accountant then goes and helps you find the best accountant, that makes a lot of sense. Like, quite naturally, it feels like that works. So I decided to go and help software companies hire salespeople and sales leaders. That's how it started a bit over 5 years ago. And in the meantime, Bluebird has approximately 25 people. We have offices in Amsterdam and Sydney. And we, in the meantime, have former salespeople and sales leaders working at Bluebird. We have former marketing leaders working at Bluebird. We have developers, engineers, product people who are working at Bluebird, and they all do recruitment, especially in the niche that they have domain expertise in. So we do both go-to-market recruitment and tech recruitment. And we specifically focus on software and AI startups and scale-ups. And how we know each other, I think it's valuable for the listeners to hear that, because if
Yeah.
they enjoy founder-led sales, it means they rate you, and rightfully so. Seth became my mentor when I was still working at FastSpring. We met at a leadership event, and I've learned a lot from him. So many of the things I'll say today, when we're touching upon certain topics, and many of the things I say in a lot of my sales meetings and when I'm advising founders, a lot of that knowledge I owe to you,
Thank you.
which is also like, so our personal relationship and what you've done for me in my career is one of the big reasons why I decided to sponsor founder-led sales. Like, from a more strategic perspective, our missions align so well. I think, like, bottom line, you guys are simply trying to help as many founders as you possibly can through the knowledge that you've built over the years, advising so many different companies. And my expertise and my superpower of myself and my team is really in hiring. So our mission statement is that we want to help as many founders as possible reach their full potential with their software company through hiring. So I think it's a very natural fit.
It is, it is. And going back to when we first met, now that you've made me a bit nostalgic going down memory lane, but I remember you speaking in the conversation, and I think it was a round table. And I was like, oh, this guy's smart. And then after we were talking about me giving you some guidance, I was like, kid, I think you're going to be giving me the guidance pretty soon here. And it was wonderful to see you consider starting a recruitment firm, and the idea that having that wisdom of having done the jobs, having managed those people, and that being your superpower, it's clearly the mission held up and kind of that thesis held up, that as I introduce founders to you, it's obvious that like when we speak, we're of one brain. You know exactly what I'm looking for, and then what that founder's looking for. Because often I'm coaching them on how to, frame the candidate. And then when I work with anybody of your team, I'd say it's compliments to you of making great hires, is that I know when they're working with someone on your team, they're in good hands, because I talk to the folks on your team and I explain to them, hey, they're hitting me up on WhatsApp. So I've gotten to know them personally, and it's just like, of one brain. They know what I'm looking for. And again, it's a high standard for that first sales hire. But let's get into it a little bit for founders considering a recruiter. Why select a recruiter? Like, what is the benefits? And let's get into some talk shop a little bit about, on the inside, how you think about it, what you see from founders, what they should know on making a decision on selecting a recruiter.
Yeah. I'll answer that question. And I would actually also be really curious to get your perspective afterwards, just to get like two different, because obviously I'm a bit biased in a way, but I'll try to give a neutral and independent answer as much as I can. But I think when it comes to a lot of positions, and you'll hear me talk a lot about the sales perspective, like this part of founder-led sales, but we also do tech recruitment, but my background is in sales, so I'll focus on that. If you look at the top like 5 or 10% of salespeople, what they bring in compared to an average performer, the difference is stellar. So I think from a return on investment perspective, it is assuming that you're working with a recruitment company that can actually deliver that 5 to 10%. And that is difficult. Like, that's not easy. And we can talk a bit more about what to look for when you're selecting a recruitment company. But if you have a recruitment company that can truly find that 5 to 10%, then it's a no-brainer, because there's a really clear ROI. Then if you're a company like Zoom, you might not need a recruitment company, because your brand is so strong that if you put out a vacancy online, you probably get lots of applicants, and maybe even really good ones. But if you're a startup or a scale up, the likelihood of you having that brand already, and that the top 5 to 10% who are typically not actively looking, that they're actively applying to your vacancies, is minor. And in some scenarios, and I would say especially when we work directly with founders, we're very capable of translating that founding story into what is really interesting and appealing for a first account executive to potentially join a business, or the second or the third. So those are some of the angles from which I think it would be valuable and worthy to explore working with a recruitment company. To maybe add to that, and maybe we'll touch upon it at some point, but especially for recruitment. So there's recruitment and exec search. If you're looking for VP or C-level executives, it's typically executive search. There's slightly different terms. There's different process. But if you look at recruitment, it is not uncommon for recruitment agencies to work in a no cure, no pay or contingency model, which means you only pay them as soon as they deliver. This is literally the way we work as well. So we do offer a retained model, but with most of our customers, we work based on a no cure, no pay model. And basically what we're saying is like, hey, give us 2 weeks. We'll introduce the best people that we know. And if based on that you don't feel like they're strong enough, hire people through your own vacancies. It's literally us putting in the time, presenting a couple of people who we think are great. If the company doesn't agree, they can move on and work with another agency, or see if they can find someone through vacancies. Luckily, that almost never happens.
Well, I think the question you asked me about my view on it is, I think it's an accelerant. What I mean by that is, if you have a never-ending amount of time, yeah, maybe you can get that top 5% person, right? But when you don't have time because you need to grow and you need to fill a role, then what is your time worth as a founder? What is your time worth as it appeals to screening CVs, going through all of this? And if you have no experience with it, one, it's a mess. And then two, months go by, right? And I'm working with another company right now that isn't working with a recruiter. And it's taking more time. And I know if we were working with you, we just have those candidates really fast. I think the other thing is top 5% people can be selective of who they work with. Selling them on the role is also important to get them excited to want to jump through the hoops of, an interview process and go through the whole process of, you know, joining that company. It's an opportunity cost for them. And I think a lot of founders miss that. They just think everybody should just join their company. It's like, yeah, maybe they should, but they need to understand why and they need to be sold this a bit. And I
Yeah.
think the other thing that you told me that's really funny is that early on, if you present the best candidate first, then the founders assume that that's an average candidate and then want better candidates. I know it's a little bit of a sidebar. How have you figured out how to manage expectations with founders when in 2 weeks you all of a sudden give them better candidates than they've ever seen before? Or if they've seen nobody, they just assume like, well, that's average. Let's hold out a bit and wait for the best one.
Yeah. So two things to add to what you're saying, like, because I think the most valuable part that we bring is, I think there's two sides to it. Is one of them is because of our background, top people really want to speak with us. And the other side is that we have a full qualification method on how we qualify salespeople. I'm specifically mentioning this because when you're working with not everyone that's on founder-led sales is also working with you as an advisor. So when they're not working with you as an advisor, it means they don't have someone to really know what excellent looks like. And we have built a qualification method on how to qualify whether salespeople are actually excellent. You've seen it before. And also to founders that are listening that maybe do not want to work with an agency straight away, want to try it themselves, I'm still happy to share that qualification method. So if anyone's interested, they can ask. To your questions, integrity is one of our core values, which means I don't want to hold back any enthusiasm when it so often happens you're on a meeting with a company and you've done a proper intake. And then based on everything you've heard, you're like, I know this one person, and I think they are the perfect fit. It is often also the perfect fit in that case. What I do now is make sure I communicate really clearly that that's not just something I'm saying, because a lot of recruiters have a tendency of saying that, and ensure that they quickly have a couple of people to compare it to. But also be really clear, like the first few people we introduce are typically the absolute best people, because the longer it takes, the wider we have to cast our net, which means the less close it is to the ideal profile that we sketch together.
Yeah, I think that when I say accelerant, that's exactly it. It's like instead of sifting through all the candidates, it's like, here's three. You're like, thank you. That's good. Let's do
Yeah.
this. So maybe
Yeah.
getting in.
And
Sorry, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt you, yeah, but and realistically, like for a startup or a scale up, if you just put out vacancies and you don't have someone internally, like you can even try yourself. Like if you have the time for it, go to LinkedIn, set up a search, go message those people yourself. Just don't lean on a vacancy if you don't have a massive brand, because the likelihood of that working out is just really slim.
It is. So, kind of take me through. We talked about ROI of candidates, right? And it's true. That's one of my mantras all the time. You've heard me talk about it. Is kind of what you can get from those top candidates from a pure revenue standpoint, also but culture, setting a tone and a benchmark of what the team is going to operate at, so you can bring in other people at that level. Just makes all the difference in the world. But to work with a recruiter, you're going to pay for it. So can you take us through kind of what it costs to work with a recruiter and like with the typical models you said about no cure, contingency, like, for someone doesn't know anything or is just thinking about this, like what can they expect to spend?
So recruiters work almost always when it's for individual contributors that you're looking to hire. So anything that's not C or VP level, they typically work on a contingency basis, which means you don't pay anything up until the point that a recruiter places someone with your company. They charge a fee on either the base salary or the on-target earnings, and on-target earnings are base salary plus commission. Something to really look at closely. Like,
Yeah, so I have a question about this. So do most do the total compensation or do most do the salary? I've seen it both. And like, how do you know ahead of time? Like, what's your take on that?
it depends a bit on the market, but the vast majority do it based on base salary, and that's also what I would recommend. Like, I wouldn't quickly sign for a company that's trying to charge based on the OTE, because it can inflate it a lot. For exec search, for commercial leaders, it is very typical to have that based on the on-target earnings or have a fixed fee. So it's 20-25% on the base salary typically, and it depends a bit on the region. So, for example, there are quite a number of recruiters in the US and the UK, so it's more competitive over there, simply with more recruitment agencies, and there are more candidates available typically in those countries, which means fees are often a little bit lower. If you look at countries like the Netherlands or Germany, for example, it's incredibly competitive. There's not tons of different recruiters that you can choose from, so fees are typically a bit higher. And then what's important to also take into consideration, there's typically a replacement scheme. So if a candidate doesn't work out, you either get a part of your money back or they're replaced for free. Trying to think if there's anything else that's of major importance. Oh yeah, a lot of recruitment companies, this is something really to take into consideration. They lock you into a contract for example, 6 months or a year. So you cannot work with another agency during that period.
Okay.
I'm heavily against that. So we don't do that with any of our customers. So all of our customers are welcome to leave at any point. The reason why we do it that way is because, first of all, we only want customers to stay because they're happy, not because we locked them into a difficult contract. I don't think that's the way to work. I just don't stand behind that. The second reason that we do that is because sometimes we work with founders that just expect something that's completely unrealistic. Like they want to pay very little and they're expecting the world. In certain scenarios where we feel like, okay, there might be a tiny chance of this working out, we might give it a try, but we also want to step away from it if it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, there's always a clear reason for it, because realistically, there shouldn't be any roles that are impossible to fill. Like then something is incorrect.
Well, and I see where I feel, I introduce you to founders, and where I feel bad, honestly, is when the founder's expectation on the role changes when faced with reality, right? So as you say, hey, this is what I think we need. Sometimes I can't come into a situation after they've already met with you or told you what they need. And by meeting candidates, they realize, actually, we need a candidate like this. And then you have to continue on, but you've basically done two searches at that point. You found them a great candidate that they realize, like, actually the perfect candidate with that profile, it's not what we're looking for. We're looking for a different profile. So, I mean, I guess you have to be patient and just calibrate whether it's worth it for you, and whether some changes are expected and you learn. Everybody's learning, and whether it's reasonable or not.
Yeah. And we might find out, like, if it's a very specific niche role that we might not have specific expertise in. Like, we recently helped a company that specifically wanted to sell to the largest telephony businesses in the world. That was such a specific niche that we didn't immediately have a massive network. So we also needed to find out what the budget was that was required to hire those best people. So there is some risk to it for us as an organization, but we don't mind, because we know that if we go through that founder journey, we figure it out together. It's always a bit of a puzzle. It's also fun to go through it. Like, it might be slightly less lucrative than a later stage company that tells us, hey, we need 6 account executives and this is exactly what we need. Like, that's easier and more lucrative, but we're just more passionate about helping those earlier stage startups hire the best possible people. And then if you deliver really well, you have a relationship for the next years. And once they raise their rounds of funding, they stay super loyal. So I just got called by the CEO of one of our companies that we started working with them 4.5 years ago. So in the summer of 2020, we've placed close to 40 people there now, I think like 35, 36, and including the CEO. And the CEO just called me and he was like, okay, yeah, we now need a VP of revenue. Like, they've hired their entire senior leadership team through us. They are now with hundreds of people doing really
It also
well.
gives you such good insights on their culture and right? You've hired all these salespeople, you know their profile. So if you're hiring a sales leader, you know what they're going to, inherit when they join, and what's going to be a good fit in theory or not.
Yeah. And at some point, like, we know companies so well that even if companies are not hiring, we speak with someone and we're like, this is exactly, and then we say the name, like, this is exactly a Bluebird. And then we introduce, and we have some companies that we work with that have met the team that we have at Bluebird, and they just say, we just want a Bluebird.
Yeah.
Which is also pretty cool.
So let's talk about that a little bit around founders working with recruiters. Like, how does a founder set themselves up for success when engaging a recruiter?
Yeah, my first recommendation would be, like, if you're a founder, you also want to be able to lean on the recruitment agency. You don't need to have all the answers yourself, except if you're working with an advisor like yourself, then they should know what they need. But not everyone has an advisor. So you should be able to lean on a recruitment company a bit. So you need a high level idea of what you should be looking for, but you also want to be advised by the recruitment company that you're working with, assuming that they have the right intentions and are not just trying to make it easy for themselves. So from that perspective, I really recommend to look for an agency that's as boutique as possible. So if you're working with a very large recruitment firm, what happens in practice often is that you're speaking with a very impressive director within the business, and then it's a very junior person who just graduated who's doing the work in the background. When you're working with a very boutique firm or highly dependent on word of mouth, of testimonials, reviews, etc., they will be way more keen to deliver really well. And the chances of their network being highly valuable for what you're looking for is also significantly higher. So boutique over larger corporations and large recruitment firms.
Well, and I also think it goes, I mean, obviously a huge fan, so I'll continue to promote you, but the idea of having salespeople and sales leaders doing the recruiting that can talk about how to set up compensation, right? Because the question I always get is like, all right, so we have this base salary plus an OTE. In theory, it's great. So there's a variable portion. Like, so how do we, like, what goes into that, right? So I'm building it with them because the candidate's going to say, so how do I get that part? And founders who haven't done it before don't know. And so to work with a recruiter that can say, hey, based on your model, I mean, it's insights that are invaluable that a junior or someone who hasn't been in sales or hasn't recruited a lot of salespeople just wouldn't know. And they'd be just regurgitating something they read online that the founder could read online, and who knows.
Yeah. Also, like, I'm a go-to-market leader at heart. I've been a go-to-market leader for years, and I simply love advising founders. So it goes way beyond just placing someone. I had a founder email me today. I was looking to potentially do an angel investment in them. And we're still talking about that. And then he had some questions around how to set up his commission model, what the average salaries were. And I was providing him with that input. But I'm doing that a lot. Like, we also work with Index Ventures. We work with Sequoia Capital, Point Night Capital, et cetera, et cetera. And they often introduce us to founders way before they are hiring because they just need help and advice on some go-to-market stuff. And next to the fact that I'm a go-to-market leader by heart, I'm also now in a kind of a helicopter view of what all of these hundreds of different top software companies are doing. So it's a very valuable perspective that I can share with founders. Also, genuinely, to everyone listening, everyone part of Founder-led Sales, like, if you also want to speak with me regarding some advice around certain topics, I'm happy to help.
Well, and we're happy to have you sharing advice. So for those folks who are either currently working for a recruiter, and I hear it, not with you, but with other founders working with recruiters, they're not happy, right? And I'm always wondering, well, are their expectations reasonable? How do you do this? So like, when you're talking to a founder, advising them on how to work with you or any recruiter, what does that relationship look like? How does that actually work? What should they expect from a good recruiter?
So in first instance, I would first want to understand, like, okay, how many other companies have you worked with that are like us? What kind of examples do you have of companies that we've worked with? Can you show us testimonials, or can we speak with a couple of companies that you've worked with just to get that social proof? Like, that shouldn't be an issue for most recruitment companies. And then I think it's really important to quite quickly have the idea that the person you're speaking with knows more about this topic than you do, so they can properly advise you around who you should be looking for. Because realistically, and I don't think this is an expectation a lot of companies have from recruiters, but if you're working with a recruitment agency and you're paying a hefty fee, like, in the end, it's not a small amount of money. You should be able to expect that they are better at this than you are. So that means that when you're talking about what you're looking for, that they ask great questions, that they get all the information they need to successfully fill the role, but that they also, based on hearing everything you're saying, they summarize it, but then also come up with some advice like, hey, this is what I would do in your situation. And maybe you're putting too much emphasis on this, but there's actually a must-have that I would like to add to it. That's not making their work easier, but it's just being honest about the fact what this company truly needs. We run into companies every now and then that say, hey, Michiel, we're looking for a chief revenue officer. And then I'm like, okay, great. Like, a C-level title, that's, easy to sell for me as a recruiter. It's typically hard searches, but a C-level title is easy to sell. And then they start talking to me and I'm asking questions, and everything I'm hearing is sales. Like, they're not talking about marketing. They're not talking about customer success. So it's actually not a chief revenue officer position. It's a VP sales position. Really often when we speak with startups, they're working with the wrong titles and setting themselves up for a very difficult situation on the longer term. So I'm advising those companies like, hey, to me, it sounds like you need a VP sales that can work hand in hand with a marketing manager. And that makes my job more difficult because I cannot give a fancy C-level title away, but I do know it's what's best for the company that I'm working with. And realistically, almost in every conversation, there are things that the companies we're speaking with are missing in the qualifications that they're looking for, which we add to it, despite the fact that it's making our job harder.
Well, I
So
think you
that
know if they don't get the right candidate first, they're not coming back for a second because the business is going to flop and or they're just it's your fault that right they look at you as it's your fault that they got a bad candidate, even though I mean they're ultimately the decision maker. So once they're engaged, what can they expect from a recruiter, or in your case, what can they expect from Blueberg? So you've refined the qualification criteria, they're getting candidates. What does that kind of relationship look like? What should they expect?
So we typically set up a Slack channel with our companies. If they don't have a Slack channel, we might set up a WhatsApp group, or we do it in whatever fashion is required, but typically a Slack group. And the main metric that we track internally is how many days it takes us to introduce the candidate that our customer ends up hiring, which is 7 working days. So on average, it takes us 7 working days to introduce the person that our customers hire. Typically for a pioneering role, typically takes a little bit longer. The more specific the role, the longer it will take, but around 1-2 weeks should be typically doable. And then within just a few days, based on the people that are already in our network, we should be able to introduce 3-4 profiles quite quickly. And then if it's a very specific niche role and we need to set up a specific search for it on top of it, then the week after, there will be a few more introductions. And in that introduction is a really clear explanation of how this candidate fits the must-have criteria and which nice-to-have criteria they fit as well or they don't. But we also advise in our introductions the parts where we feel like there might be a bit of a risk. Not to say that it's a red flag where we should not be introducing someone because we are introducing this person, but not just to sell the candidate, but also show like, hey, this is something that I would dive a bit deeper into.
I like that. I'm always assessing risk with every candidate. As you start to hand over these candidates, I think sales advisors or even investors, anybody that's hired salespeople before is a huge asset, obviously, when it comes to interviewing folks. But you must work with a lot of founders that don't have someone on the team that's hired salespeople and managed salespeople previously. Like, what do you advise for their interview process for them to be set up for success? And like, how do you navigate that when they have no reference or they've never hired or managed salespeople?
Yeah, to be honest, that's pretty difficult.
Okay, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but it came up. I was like,
No,
how do you
yeah,
manage
no, I
that?
know, but it's a really, really good question. But so we really educate those founders what to look for. So maybe to give an example, and the things I'm going to say now, like this is our one brain situation, so this won't be anything new to you. But maybe I can tell you a bit about like when you hire that first salesperson, what should you look for? So
Okay, yeah, let's dive into that. I mean, and
yeah,
again, this is why this is such a great collaboration, is because it's tried and true that we've already collaborated so many times, right? We quickly counted 20, and that might be on the low side. And it's the first sales hire makes all the difference. And I joke about being a pain in the ass, but the standard for that person is really high because getting it right after they start is really important. So I'll pass it back over to you to kind of dive into that post-hire expectations.
Yeah. So as soon as you start working with an agency, you're looking for your first sales hire. And I'd say this is applicable to the first 2 or 3 or so. But one thing which is an absolute non-negotiable for us is that the account executive that they hire has startup experience. Like a lot of founders still to this day, when someone has a big logo on their CV, they get excited about it, but it really doesn't work. Like someone is used to that corporate model. They're used to having a lot of support and they're not used to a pretty chaotic environment where they have to figure everything out themselves and there's not a clear process that they can lean on. So startup experience from our perspective is a non-negotiable. Then when you look at the type of account executive that fits your organization, so we start looking at, have they sold a product of similar complexity before? So if someone can sell Zoom, it doesn't mean they can sell a very complex ERP platform, for example. So we start looking at that to understand whether they're capable of selling the complexity of a founder's solution. We also look at average deal size and how long the sales cycles take. Like those 3 things together give a really good feel of how experienced or what level of intelligence this AE needs to have.
And high intelligence. I think
High
that's
intelligence
you're
overall is
looking
really important.
yeah, it's critical for that first sales hire. Maybe not for the 10th, but the first, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll give you an example where, I'm always very careful with saying always or never because to give one example that, because I agree with you 99% of cases, but we had one company that was selling reservation software for restaurants. And it was just a really nice app that you could put on your website and you could quickly make a reservation at the restaurant. And we didn't place the most intelligent person there, but this was a person with huge work ethic, massive passion for hospitality, which I think in most cases the specific passion is not even needed. And they did a phenomenal job, and they just signed up like hundreds of customers within a year. So for example, when it comes to very low deal sizes, very low product complexity, it is actually less important.
Well, and IQ, I mean, we get a bit philosophical, and that's what you and I
Yeah.
tend to do, but if they
We
have a ton
promise
of
each other
industry,
not to do that.
yeah, all right. But if there's a ton of industry wisdom, that's kind of gets into the IQ category versus just raw horsepower IQ. But yeah, yes. So there's always trade-offs.
And then the next one, like there's four more things that we look at. So I'll just go through the complete list
Yeah,
because I do think
please.
it's very valuable. We look for someone with a challenger sale profile. So for any founder that hasn't read that book, I highly recommend reading the Challenger Sale. There's newer versions and everything, but I still stick with the Challenger Sale. I'm a big believer in it. It's basically a sales methodology, and it talks about what profile is the most successful sales profile. And it's a research by Gartner done with thousands of salespeople to understand what makes someone super successful. And it's highly applicable to startups and scale ups. So we qualify people based on
Can
that.
you explain it briefly, please?
Yeah, high level. So because there's quite a lot of facets to it, but it needs to be someone that can push a prospect out of their comfort zone. Because a prospect needs to make a decision to make a change that's already big. They need to potentially choose for a startup that they haven't worked before, and they might feel like they don't need it yet because most startups have something innovative and they don't know that they need it. So this person needs to be able to show like the world is changing and where we are going to be in 5 years is different from where we are now. If you're not adapting to it and your competitors are, the likelihood of your business might be non-existent in a few years. People need to be able to have those tough love conversations and be comfortable with the uncomfortable. They also need to be able to talk quite easily about money. So those are some of the topics that are important for a challenger.
So explaining
Those are
that continue. Sorry.
Yeah, and qualifying that it's not easy. But if you read the book, there's also some examples of how to do that. But I'm a huge believer in that methodology. There's also like an actual sales methodology in that book that founders can use with their like discovery call and demo deck, etc. And I implemented it at both of the software companies where I worked, and I'm using it today with all my hiring still. And I've literally hired over 70, 80 people for my own teams and very, very little attrition. So yeah, big believer in the challengers.
And so getting into founders' expectation setting post-sale without an advisor, you were talking about that before, the methodology that you use for qualification. How do you, again, set a founder up for success to select the right person and set those expectations post-sale? Again, you said it's hard to do without someone involved, but what would be the interview process, for example, for a founder?
Yeah, so to be honest, like this with founders who really don't have anyone advising them, like we have to take that position because otherwise the likelihood of especially a technical founder making the wrong decision is just really high. So a big part of this qualification we then do for them, and we inform them about all of it on how they scored in our model. And then like the next part that I recommend startups to look out for, and this is something that founders can do way better than we can, is to find someone who clearly is passionate about helping you build your organization. So passion, grit, and ambition are the three things that we specifically look for when it comes to hiring your first couple of account executives. And it's not necessarily passion and ambition for your own career and your own gain, but really someone that you're speaking with them. And like, for example, we have one of the companies that we work with, they're in robotics. We have some salespeople that they don't care about that at all. And we have some salespeople that are super excited about that. You just need to see that someone gets a spark in their eyes when you're talking about the founding story, and you feel like they're sitting next to you looking at the business like, oh, how, like, I have all these ideas and how we can build it. So I think that passionate piece is really important, and we're not present at those interviews. So for a founder to spot whether that light is lit is really important. And I think a task for a founder that's really important is when we deliver a couple of great people that they can potentially hire. I know we're also one brain on this, but founders really need to sell the opportunity in first instance instead of being really proud of your startup, which is completely fine. I'm also proud of my company, but when I hire recruiters, they don't have recruitment experience. So I'm speaking to heads of sales, marketing managers, developers. I really need to convince them in first instance to join, and then I start qualifying them. And that's exactly what startup founders should do as well. And like, yeah, we can sell it a bit, but in the end, they're not going to make a decision based on how we pitch the company. They're always going to make that decision based on how excited the founder is. So I think doing that at the start of the hiring process is incredibly important.
I think that's quite tactical too, because if the founder is explaining the company and why it's exciting and the founder has dedicated their life to this and the candidate is not sharing the passion, it's quite obviously not a fit. And that must be the toughest part as a recruiter, that you can check all the boxes and put these people in front of the founder. But if there isn't a founder salesperson fit, it's like that magic doesn't happen. There's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, true. Luckily, like with doing this work longer and longer, you become really good at identifying what will be a good personality match and what will be complementary to each other. Yeah.
I love it.
And maybe two last things
Yeah, please.
for that qualification. One is too generic. I have it on a slide, but because I send those slides out every now and then. But we typically recommend companies to hire someone with 2 years of AE experience at least. For a lot of companies, also not necessarily 20 plus years of experience, but ideally, 2-3 years of AE experience. But if it's very high velocity and lower deal sizes, then you might be able to do with less experience. If it's very heavy enterprise deals, you will most likely need a bit more experience than that. And then the last piece, what founders should be looking for is, assuming you're not overwhelmed with inbound leads, which is the case for almost no startups, they need to be excellent at prospecting, because you want this first sales hire also to build the playbook. I know I'm repeating some of your words,
No, I
but
love it. That's why I'm lighting up.
the first sales hire needs to be able to build a playbook for the business development team, basically.
Yeah, and having a recruiter or a partner, anyone kind of vetting out whether that outbound is truly high quality, kind of thoughtful, methodical prospecting versus what an entire generation of salespeople and SDRs went through recently, which was just template spam. Right, there's a huge difference there. And I think, like, again, we probably agreed we wouldn't get philosophical, but like, I think having someone help you understand the difference there, I think is critical. And that's why I think Bluebird is the best, because you understand what I mean by that, and your team understands that too, even if the founder doesn't.
I had Lars Mangelsdorf. Do you know him by any chance? The co-founder of Yokoi.
No, I haven't met him. No.
He's a great guy, super talented, around his 30s, just exited his business to TravelPerk. He, just as to reiterate that to founders, cold calling is in 90% of cases still really the best way to go about doing business development. So for anyone who thinks that's dead, it's not dead yet.
And if your account executive isn't willing to roll up their sleeves and do the prospecting, which is essential at any sales role, right? Even if it's just to chase down leads that haven't booked a meeting, right? And they're not willing to cold call and pick up the phone, your likelihood of their success is just going to be much less, right? And just, well, you've been super generous with your time, generous in this partnership and this sponsorship, and I love you. This is quite magical. And anytime I was excited about this interview, because anytime we talk, I learn. So selfishly, I get to reap the benefits from this, but I know the founders listening in will benefit. The founders who are part of founder-led sales, and even the ones who aren't, that end up working with you. I think it's going to be some magic, and I'm just so happy that this could come together.
We're both super excited. So I'm super glad that we're kicking this off, and absolute no-brainer.
Well, and we'll have more interviews. I think there's more stuff to dive into, more announcements to come, more collaborations, and just a wonderful continuation of a wonderful partnership.
Absolutely.
Thanks, have a great afternoon.